make it a little bit lower so that things or something that doesn't show much. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's always fun to speak from a mic in this role. One housekeeping announcement, if you can please set your cell phone to do not disturb. That was your one warning. It's a special pleasure to welcome you all to tonight to this important lecture. The Margot Jeremias Memorial Kristallnacht Commemoration Lecture is an annual lecture that is planned to coincide roughly with the Kristallnacht and is dedicated to perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust in general and Kristallnacht in particular. And it's dedicated in loving memory of Margot Jeremias, who many of us had the opportunity, the privilege to meet. One of the lasting legacies, the many, many legacies that she has, was to remind us the importance of understanding and taking stock of Kristallnacht and not letting that day pass us by. Mrs. Jeremias, as many of us knew her as, was only 12 years old on the infamous Kristallnacht November night. And that represented a moment where her life took an alternate route. And really listening to her story of courage and heroism, not just to survive, but to come to America and thrive, and to stand up to that evil that was, and be able to teach the next generation about peace and tolerance, about standing up in the face of evil, but having that courage and that charisma. And of course, ever prideful of her family. And it's a special pleasure to acknowledge the sponsorship of Helen Les Loew, making this possible every year. And what a beautiful testament this is to Mrs. Jeremias' memory, and really to the important work that we continue to do as a community to take the lessons of the Holocaust and make sure that they remain the legacy, the lessons, the stories that we tell to the future. It's a special honor to welcome Dr. Rivka Schwartz. Helen's going to do the introduction, but I just want to say I've gained so much from her insight and perspective, from her candid and thoughtful, thought-provoking perspective on the Jewish community, on the Orthodox community, on the way we think about Jewish education. And I'm just really overjoyed by the opportunity to be able to have her come and share her thoughts and her insights with our community. Again, thank you so much to Helen and Les. Thank you to Voices of Hope and to Jewish Family Services for co-sponsoring tonight. Special thank you to Katie, our Director of Operations, for making sure that this seamlessly runs, and so many other things. With that, it's my honor to call up Helen to share some words and introduce our keynote speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us both in person and on Zoom. Last year, after the events of October 7th, Les and I could not contemplate sponsoring a lecture. We were so overwhelmed, distracted, in pain, as were all of you. We could think of nothing else but the ongoing war in Israel. And now, a year later, with many hostages remaining in Gaza, and our brave IDF soldiers fighting on many fronts, with families missing loved ones and thousands of wounded, with many families unable to return home, it's still difficult to worry about anything else. And yet, getting together for a serious discussion about the Holocaust and the many comparisons to what is happening today seems right. Les and I returned from Israel just a few days ago, and we have watched with grave concern all the events unfolding there and the sharp increase in anti-Semitism throughout the world. My mother, Margot Jeremias, who passed away 6.5 years ago, was a staunch Zionist. And her thoughts, while following the events in the world, would immediately be making comparisons to the events in Germany, and particularly to those of Kristallnacht, a pivotal event in her life and one that she felt did not get enough attention. On November 9th and 10th, 1938 in Germany, the Nazis burned down synagogues, vandalized Jewish homes, schools, and businesses, and killed close to 100 people. Known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, this event was a turning point in the victimization of Jews. I picture my mom, only 12 years old at the time, as her world changed overnight. She took a train to Heidelberg, where she attended a Jewish school, heard the sound of broken glass and people shouting, "Down with the Jews, kill the Jews." She was advised to return home, but had to wait 2 hours for a train, terrified about what would happen to her. When she got to her village, she saw her father and other men moving the Gabai's belongings from the shul to another home. Because the synagogue was close to other buildings, the Nazis could not burn and set it on fire. Instead, they gathered the Torahs, Telesim, Sidurim, and built an enormous bonfire. My grandfather and the other Jewish men in the town were arrested, and my mom lived in constant fear. Her father was allowed to return home after 5 weeks because he had served in World War I. Much worse was yet to come, and my mother spent time in labor camps and in hiding. Eventually, she came to the United States, where she met my father and started a family. It wasn't until our son Daniel was in school and his teacher asked my mother to speak to his class that she began to talk publicly about the horrors she lived through. She shared her experiences many times, and she always spoke of the importance of an education, the need to be kind to others, to be open-minded, but still vigilant. She was very proud of her family, and she spoke of her 18 great-grandchildren as proof that Hitler did not win. We are indebted to Rabbi Brander, who conceived of this lecture as an appropriate way to honor my mom. He knew her well, and they had a warm and special relationship. We are grateful for his hard work in suggesting our speaker and making arrangements for this evening. Thank you as well to Kathy Fishman and Voices of Hope for co-sponsoring this lecture. Your work is more important than ever, and we appreciate your many contributions to our community and beyond. It is now my honor to introduce this evening's speaker. Dr. Rivka Schwartz earned her PhD in History of Science from Princeton University. She has spent over 20 years in the field of Jewish secondary and post-secondary education. Dr. Schwartz serves as the Associate Principal and Co-Director of Machon Siach at SAR High School in Riverdale, New York, and as a Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She writes and lectures widely about contemporary issues of contemporary importance in the North American Orthodox community. We look forward to hearing her valuable insights.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Brander. Thank you so much to the Loew family for your sponsorship and for that generous introduction. Talking about the Holocaust is never particularly easy, and it's particularly less easy over the past 13 months, as some of us, I am young enough to have grown up a very secure and confident American, and old enough to have children whom I am now raising in this world, and really wondering about the world I thought I lived in and the world that I see myself living in now. But it is particularly important at this time and under these circumstances that we ask ourselves carefully and thoughtfully whether analogies of our contemporary moment to the Holocaust are appropriate, whether they illuminate or they obscure. We have to be thoughtful about this. We have to be careful in our understanding of what the events of the Holocaust are and what the events of the contemporary day are, so that we make sure we are applying any comparisons, again, in a way that is apt and that sheds light, one, not in a way that is inapt and perhaps inadvertently actually ends up minimizing what the Holocaust was. The events of October 7th have an immediacy and a pull and a power. And all of us have heard them described many times as the bloodiest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. And certainly in the 13 months since, as we have seen all kinds of anti-Semitism on the streets of Europe and on American college campuses, as we have heard talk of Jews in positions of power or wealth, manipulating things behind the scenes the echoes have seemed perhaps inevitable. But it was only last night that we stood saying the Ma'ariv prayer that closes out Shabbat. And as part of the Ma'ariv prayer, we recite a special bracha for Ma'ariv and Motzei Shabbat of Atah Chonantanu. The bracha that says the Havdalah prayer that divides between Shabbat and the days of the week. And the Atah Chonantanu prayer is inserted in the bracha of Shmona Esrei, in the bracha of the Amidah of Atah Chonin L'Adam Da'at. You grant people understanding. And the famous question is, why does this separation between Shabbat and the days of the week belong here in the bracha of Da'at? And the rabbi's answer is, Im ein Da'at Havdalah Minayin. If we do not have understanding and discernment, how will we draw distinctions? It is the ultimate human faculty to be able to understand, to be able to think, to be able to analyze. And if we can do that, then we can see when things are alike and when things are not alike. And then we can make sure that when we are drawing comparisons, they are appropriate. And if we are making distinctions, we understand why. And so I would like us not simply to draw upon the Holocaust as an evocation of the greatest trauma in Jewish history, or certainly the greatest trauma in Jewish history in the past 2 millennia since the destruction of the Second Temple, and therefore to apply it to the horrific trauma that the Jewish people suffered 13 months ago, but to really understand what the Holocaust was, to try to have a sense of what parts of that comparison apply, what parts of that comparison blessedly do not, and then to think all the same about what lessons might be available for us to learn from it. So let's actually begin by talking about what Kristallnacht was. We sometimes talk about Kristallnacht as a list of numbers. Thousands of Jewish businesses vandalized, hundreds of shuls burned, tens of thousands of Jewish men arrested and taken to concentration camps, which then were prison camps that people were released from. Death camps would come later. Violent attacks unleashed on Jews in cities across Germany. But it's important to realize that what Kristallnacht really was, what it really stands for, is the first act of coordinated mass violence unleashed against the Jewish community by the government. Although the claim of the Nazi government at the time was that this was a spontaneous uprising of passion on the part of the German people in response to the murder of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jewish teenager named Herschel Grunspan. Although that was the claim that the German people were spontaneously rising up to express themselves because this murder had taken place. In fact, we now know it's really been very well established. This was coordinated, ordered, designed. It was not at all spontaneous. And so that is what Kristallnacht stands for. It stands for the first coordinated violent action against the Jewish community of Germany by the government. But it's not the beginning of the story. By a long shot, it's not the beginning of the story. Hitler comes to power in 1933, and already in 1933, the Nazis start burning Jewish books. By 1935, of course, we have the passage of the Nuremberg laws, which for the first time racially define what it is to be Jewish and strip German Jews of their citizenship. The next year, we will have a law that says that Jewish doctors cannot treat German patients. Also the next year, of course, in 1936, we have Hitler's Berlin Olympics, which become a showcase for Nazi Germany, but it was well known at the time that Jewish athletes in Germany were excluded from participating and from competing. By 1937, we have the seizure, expropriation, and so-called Aryanization of Jewish property. And so by the time we get to 1938 and we get to Kristallnacht and the first unleashing of governmentally sanctioned violence against the Jewish people, it is not simply an act of violence in the streets. It is the culmination of a legal process that has been going on for years of stripping Jews of their citizenship, their rights, their professions, their property, their seats in the universities. And so as shocking as it might have been just a few days ago, to see Israeli soccer fans attacked on the streets of a European city. And as much as that might have evoked for us horrendous memories and trauma, and the date coming as it did in the first week of November might have lent itself to Kristallnacht comparisons, I think it's really important to realize the ways in which that is actually something very different. Kristallnacht was not a spontaneous uprising of violence, and it was an uprising of violence that came built upon years of stripping Jews of legal, social, political rights. And it is in that context that we need to understand what Kristallnacht is and what the Holocaust is. And as painful and devastating as the events of October 7th were, and as unsettling and profoundly shocking as the anti-Semitic actions that we have seen in the United States and in Europe in the months since have been, I think it is very important for us to recognize two profoundly important differences. The first one is the existence of the State of Israel. The events of October 7th were deeply traumatic to Israelis. They laid bare unrecognized weaknesses in the Israeli intelligence infrastructure, in the Israeli security infrastructure. They left Jews feeling vulnerable in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel, in a way they had not felt vulnerable at least for 50 years. They were deeply unsettling. And with all of that, we are still talking about a Jewish sovereignty, a Jewish state, a Jewish army, and even if they can't say it, we can say it, Jewish nuclear weapons. And that means that that is a reality that is simply unlike anything that existed. I state the obvious, but I think it's important for us to stop and sit with that reality and think about it. As profoundly horrifying as the events of October 7th are, they are simply not analogous to a time when Jews lived wherever they lived, at the mercy of the sovereignties and the polities and the governments and the states around them. Robert Frost famously writes in a poem that the definition of home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to let you in. In 1938, there is no place in the world that is home for the Jews. There is no place in the world that when you have to go there, they have to let you in. And indeed, shortly before the events of Kristallnacht, but in response to all of the depredations that had been unleashed against German Jews until that point, the nations of the world gathered in the summer of 1938 at what was called the Evian Conference to talk about what should be done with the problem of Jewish refugees and Jewish asylum seekers. And every country in the world said, oh, someone should definitely take those Jews in. Just as my high school students say, not it. The Dominican Republic was willing to take Jewish refugees. Every other country in the world, including the United States of America, about whom more in a moment, said, sorry, no can do. The United States said, we're just coming out of a depression. We have a lot on our plate. Britain, which controlled the mandate for Palestine, said, we have uprisings by Palestinian residents of the mandate. This seems like a poor idea right now. We can't take any more Jews. Every country in the world explained why they couldn't take any more Jews. And so the existence, not just of Jewish sovereignty and a Jewish army, but of a Jewish homeland is something that makes the reality we are living in as unsettling and frightening and horrifying as this. And I will keep saying this. There is no need to minimize that, to minimize how unsettling and frightening and horrifying it is, to realize that there is something that is fundamentally different. Here's something else that is fundamentally different. In the 1930s, the United States of America is not the singular recognized global hyperpower that the United States of America has been for the past few decades. In the United States of America, I'm sorry to tell all those of us who are flag-waving, allegiance-pledging Americans, the United States of America was not in particularly any more of a rush to do anything for Jewish refugees and Jewish asylum seekers than anybody else was. There was a deep anti-Semitism within American political life. a deep hostility to and suspicion of the waves of Jewish immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe that had flooded into the United States from 1880 to 1924, resulting in a change to US immigration law, first the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and then the Johnson-Reed Act, the National Origins Immigration Act of 1924, which established strict quotas based on country of origin and were intentionally set to allow for more immigrants from Northern and Western Europe who were seen as more desirable, and fewer immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were seen as less desirable. Those quotas remained in place throughout the years of the Nazi rise to power and throughout the years of Jewish expropriation and loss of rights, and throughout the years of World War II and the Holocaust. Those quotas were never lifted. The United States never allowed in any additional Jews. I had a former student years ago whose grandparents were very prominent members of the American Orthodox community. They were philanthropists whose names are on many institutions in America and Israel, funding a lot of Orthodox life. And when her grandfather passed away, and I went to be Menachem Avel, this student told me that she had always been told as part of family lore that an act of Congress had been passed to enable her grandfather and his family to enter the United States during World War II. So she had hired a researcher to look it up. And the person had found out that in fact this was the case, and had found the act of Congress in the congressional record, and my former student showed it to me. It was literally an act of Congress to allow into the United States, and then it named her great-grandfather, her great-grandmother, and their 3 children, one of whom was her grandfather. And lest you think that the Congress of the United States decided to allow in 5 extra Jews, the bill that they passed then said, and next year we will decrease the quota by 5 to account for these 5 extra people that we have admitted this year. I read it myself. I saw it myself. I don't know if I would have believed it if I hadn't, but I did. They weren't allowing in 5 extra Jews. They were borrowing 5 Jews from next year's quota. This is in the middle of World War II. They would not save 5 extra Jews. Why do I say this to you? I say this to you to point out to you how wildly different the political reality is in the United States today. And even as we feel unsettled by some of what we see and hear around us, it is really important for us to be aware of and acknowledge that. So now I tell you another story. For Machon Siach, the research arm of Esther High School, for which I work, I was running a program last fall in Lincoln Square Synagogue, a large shul on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I was going down in the evening to run this program. I drive up to Lincoln Square with all the materials that I needed for the program in the back of my van. And outside of Lincoln Square Synagogue, as we saw outside so many of our shuls in the fall of 2023, there are 2 police officers, not dressed in normal police officer garb, but wearing the plates of body armor over their uniforms and carrying not their service revolvers, but semi-automatic weapons, standing there in front of Lincoln Square Synagogue. I pull up in front of the shul. I don't know if this is a New York City special thing. I think it's a New York City special thing. There are like 6 competing traffic rule signs. No parking between 6 and 3, only trucks unloading Monday, alternate side of the street parking. I can't figure out, I can't make heads or tails. I finished a PhD, I can't make heads or tails of the parking signs. I am allowed to park here, I'm not allowed to park here. I have no idea. So I get out of the car and I ask the police officer, I say, officer, I can't figure out the signs. I'm here to run a program in the synagogue. I have all the stuff in my car. I want to unload. Am I allowed to park here now? Police officer looks at me and says some very ordinary words that I do not think I will ever forget. He said to me, I really don't care. We're here for you. And I thought to myself, my great-grandparents who left Bjejan, don't ask me any more than that, but it was called Bjejan, to come to the Lower East Side of New York City, could not ever have imagined that the police in Bjejan would say, we're here for you. And I'm not sure that they could have imagined that the police in the New York City that they arrived in would have said, we are here for you. And all of us in the Jewish community felt comforted and protected and safe when we saw law enforcement officers around our shul after October 7th, because we understood they were there to protect us. They were not part of a group there to attack us. And that speaks to something that is very different. Whatever one's feelings about national politics at any level, the current president of the United States and the current president-elect of the United States have both spoken in very strong ways in support of the state of Israel, in support of Israel's right to defend herself, in condemnation of the attacks of October 7. That relationship to the government of the most powerful country on the face of the earth is not something that our ancestors could have counted on. And that too is part of the context in which we think about the events that we are witnessing. And again, as horrifying as they are, as unsettling as they are, as frightening as they are, as disturbing as they are, it means that saying this is like 1938, there are really very important ways in which it's not like 1938. There are really very important ways in which it's not like 1938. I want to say one more thing about making that comparison before I move on to talk about, even if it isn't 1938, there are lessons we can and should learn, and what are they? There is a danger even bigger than making a comparison that's not exactly right. And the danger is that in the emotional immediacy of the events of October 7th, and the extent to which we saw them and were horrified by them, and so we reach for the Holocaust analogy to convey that horror, we actually end up minimizing the events of the Holocaust. If that sounds impossible, I want to tell you that I heard it. Over the course of the past year, we've had many speakers from Israel come address our high school, to the extent that we changed around the school schedule to create a slot once a week. Last year, we brought the whole school together. This year, we made it a little bit less frequent. It's once a month, we bring the whole school together. And we have speakers who are coming. And there are people who have had all kinds of experiences in the past year plus, have done all kinds of things, have stepped up in all kinds of heroic ways, addressing our student body and sharing what they saw and what they did and what they've been through. But one person who was someone who had a horrific personal experience with terrorism, I certainly cannot speak, hope never to be able to speak to that personal experience. But in talking about the events of October 7th, he said that the barbarism or the brutality of that day was worse than what we saw in the Holocaust. And as teacher of history, I sat there in the room as he said that to all of my high school students, deeply uncomfortable, because that only suggested to me that we have forgotten what the Holocaust was. The death toll on October 7th, as horrific as the death toll of 1,200 Israelis murdered was, is a fraction of a single-day death toll in Birkenau and Auschwitz too, when it was operating at its full capacity. And of course, that continued day after day after day after day after day. And if you meant, as perhaps this man did, that the murders of the Holocaust were industrialized and sort of impersonal, and they weren't accompanied by the kind of face-to-face brutality that we saw on October 7th, there was plenty of the Holocaust that was accompanied by the kind of face-to-face brutality that we saw on October 7th. And so I would very much want us to be careful that, again, in the immediacy of this emotional experience and reaching for something with which to express it, that we don't end up inadvertently actually minimizing what the Holocaust was. When people who are not our friends do this, we actually call Holocaust minimization a form of Holocaust denial. David Irving, who, thanks to Deborah Lipstadt, is the most famous Holocaust denier of our generation, David Irving didn't actually start off, eventually he got himself to wherever he got himself to, but he didn't start off by saying that nobody died in the Holocaust. He started off by saying, yeah, a few tens of thousands of people, maybe. It wasn't an intentional, a few hundreds of thousands, it wasn't an intentional program of elimination. That in itself, that Holocaust minimization is a form of Holocaust denial. And I would not want us, however well-intentionally and however inadvertently, to end up doing that. And so I think it's really important to say, it's really important to say what we all know, that the Holocaust is an industrial scale attempt to exterminate all Jews by people, so if you say to me, as some might, well, if given their druthers, Hamas might also want to exterminate all Jews, by a government that actually had the ability and the means to get pretty far along the way towards its goal. At a time when the Jewish people did not have their own sovereign polity and did not have the support of any global power. And so as evocative as those comparisons can be, I think it is very important that we are judicious in how we draw upon them. It is also not the case that the Holocaust is the only bad thing we have to draw upon, or that if something is not the Holocaust, it is not horrible. The unfortunate truth is that human experience and the Jewish experience give us plenty of things to draw upon for comparisons with the horrors that we have seen without requiring that everything be 1938. There are unfortunately no shortage of massacres and pogroms and other events in Jewish history that we can look towards for points of comparison without drawing upon a comparison which I think inadvertently does injustice to that which it's trying to compare. But having said that the Holocaust comparison is not always a posit, that does not mean that there is nothing for us to learn from and think about the Holocaust experience and bring to bear on the world we live in today. And here I want to talk to you a little bit about a famous fight that went on in Holocaust historiography among Holocaust historians for a long time. And that was the fight between the functionalists and the intentionalists. The intentionalists argued, and it had in fact always been Hitler's intent to attempt to eliminate all of the Jews. Going as far back as Mein Kampf, which he authored in the 1920s, if you read it, his anti-Semitism, his anti-Semitic intent is laid out there for everyone to see. And therefore, we should understand Hitler as having had a plan to exterminate and eliminate all Jews from before he rose to power, and every step that he took following his rise to power was simply the working out of what had been the plan for years and years previously. And the functionalists actually argued that if you look at some of the actions taken by the Nazi regime in its early days, and even well up into the later 1930s, it does not seem as though there was a clear intent to exterminate all Jews. There were attempts by the Nazis to expel Jews and send them abroad, except as we've said, no country wanted them. There were other attempts to adopt other ways of dealing with what, of course, they called the Jewish problem. And indeed, the Wannsee Conference, the meeting at which the Nazis say that we must adopt what they call the final solution to the Jewish problem, doesn't take place until January of 1942. Which is really relatively late in what we think of as being a Holocaust timeline. It's not until January of 1942 that this commitment to a plan of extermination is finalized. And so the functionals say this was actually something that evolved over time in response to circumstances. Without getting ourselves embroiled in a decades-old historiographic debate, I think one can see both that Hitler clearly had anti-Semitic intention from the beginning, and also that there were many points along the way in which many actors made many choices that could have been made differently. I think one thing that is very important for us to see and recognize and acknowledge is that a lot of people had a lot of choices to make along the way. And had they made those choices differently, events might have turned differently. Historians don't regard history as some inevitable playing out of forces that were set in motion, and then they had no choice but inexorably to go the way they went. Historians say there's an enormous amount of what they call contingency in history. Things depended on other things. Choices depended on other choices. Actions depended on other actions. And things didn't have to go or be or turn out the way they did, except for the chain of choices and decisions and actions and people that led things to where they ended up. Because if you believe that things were inexorably and inevitably set in motion by this one person, by Hitler, from the time that he ever first tried to take power in Germany in the 1920s, then there isn't very much for us to learn, except avoid countries where Hitler is in power. But if we think that there were many, many, many people who made many, many, many decisions and choices, and some of them could have made decisions or choices differently, then that says to us that we too are capable of making decisions and choices. I think one thing is obvious, right? One way that our community, our American Jewish community, is responding differently than the American Jewish community did in the 1930s and 1940s is that the argument that the president or the government knows what's best, and we should just be quiet and let them take care of things and not raise your voices. I think the American Jewish community has decided that we'll raise our voice when we think our voice needs to be raised, and we will make our voice heard. Thank you very much. We will not wait to be told that when the time is right or when somebody thinks this is an okay time. Or there's a bigger plan in place, so please don't raise your voice because you might derail that bigger plan. But I think there are other things that are worth saying and worth pointing out here. When we think about the inexorable, intentionalist version of the Holocaust, that Hitler always had an eliminationist plan, and an all-powerful, at least in Germany, Nazi party rose to carry out that plan, and nothing could be done to interrupt the workings of that plan, that actually takes our attention away from different people who had choices about whether or not to interrupt the workings of that plan. Some of them are the ones who interrupted the workings of that plan at enormous personal risk. The people who sheltered or hid Jews, knowing full well that if they were caught, their own lives were forfeit. There's a reason why Yad Vashem labels those people Chasidei Umot Ha'olam, the righteous among the nations, right? In rabbinic literature, the term Hasid doesn't mean like we think today, somebody who's Hasidic. It means somebody who goes above and beyond what is required of them. Somebody who is pious beyond the mere expectations, the minimal expectations of the law. There's no way you can ask or demand of someone that they risk their life for someone else, even if you can recognize it as heroic when they do so. But I think it's worth pausing a minute on that heroism before we talk about people who had the chance to disengage from the machinery of destruction, even without risk of their own life, and the choices they did or did not make to do so. There are, of course, many examples that we can talk about. I want to talk about one. There's a beautiful book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, the story of the village of Le Chambon and how goodness happened there. It's a story of a tiny little village in France, a Protestant village in France, whose minister and his wife, Andre and Magda Trocmé, found it impossible to believe when the orders came down that they were supposed to round up and hand over all their Jews, found it impossible to believe this is what God wanted of them. They should round up and hand over all their Jews. Seemed to make no sense to them, to their Christian faith, that's what they were supposed to do. So they decided they wouldn't. And the pastor led his entire congregation, which was basically the village, to shelter Jews in the village. And they did. And they did. Obviously at some measure of risk. Obviously doing that in contravention of the laws and the orders was very dangerous. And nevertheless, they did it. And it's so fascinating to see the community that did it when so many other communities around them did not. And everyone's trying to understand, is it perhaps because they were Protestants, they were a minority in Catholic France? Is it this, is it that? Was it just the charisma of this one individual minister who led his flock? But in that one village, they didn't. And think about all the people and all the lives. The machinery of destruction ground on. But for those Jews in that village in France, those decisions made all the difference. But there we're talking about people who are risking their lives. I want to tell you something more disturbing about decisions that were made when lives were not at risk. There's an historian named Christopher Browning who wrote a fascinating and horrifying book called Ordinary Men, which is the story of Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the final solution in Poland. And here's what he's writing about. Reserve Police Battalion 101 was not a unit of hardened SS men indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. It was a reserve unit. And that means it was a unit of German men who had ordinary lives. They were ordinary men. They had civilian jobs in Germany. They did whatever they did, and they were called up for reserve service and sent to Poland. But in this case, they were sent to do a particular kind of work. When we think and talk about the Holocaust, we most often, I think, revert to thinking about gas chambers and crematoria and death camps. That's actually a very Western-centric version of the Holocaust. There is a whole different Holocaust that takes place in Eastern Europe. It is a Holocaust that one historian labeled a Holocaust by bullets. And that is the Holocaust of Jews being asked to dig pits, being shot, and be buried in mass graves. East of the division of the partition of Poland and into the Soviet Union, as the Wehrmacht, as the German army advanced, the Jews there were not sent back to camps for gassing. They were simply shot where they were. Eastern Europe is full of mass graves of Jews, for a number of reasons, including that that entire area ended up behind the Iron Curtain after World War II and was simply much less accessible to the West. And also because there were virtually no survivors of the Holocaust by bullets. There were some survivors of the camps. There were virtually no survivors of the Holocaust by bullets. For all of those reasons, that story is much less well known. But the men of Reserve Battalion 101 that Browning writes about find themselves impressed into this Holocaust by bullets. That is what they are being asked to do. They are ordinary men with regular civilian jobs who've been called up for their reserve duty. And what they're being asked to do is every morning go out and stand by the pits and shoot Jewish men, women, and children. And here's the thing that Browning finds. They write home talking about how horrifying it is, how awful it is, how much they hate what they're doing. But they don't stop doing it. Unless you say, well, of course they couldn't stop doing it. They themselves would then have been shot. Browning documents that, in fact, out of concern for the psychological fragility of the people being asked to do this work, men in the unit were given the option to opt out. They could opt out of that work if they wanted to. And the ones who did faced no consequences. And yet so many others, these ordinary men, kept going along. They were told to do it. They were told they needed to do it. They were told it was important. We, all of us, are very used to following rules. I drove here, I stopped at every red light, right? We are used to following rules. That's how society functions. I once read a fascinating book that said that one of the reasons why religious kids do better in school is because religious kids are used to following rules. And school rewards following rules. So if you're used to following rules, you do better at school. Maybe being a member of a religious community in a certain way trains us to follow rules. And to get your head around that right now is the time not to follow the rule, to say this is a rule not to be followed, that might be a difficult thing to do. Even if somebody says to you, if you don't want to follow this instruction or this order, you can opt out and there will be no consequence. And so something else that I think that Browning asks us to think about, that those of us who look at the Holocaust, to look at choices and decisions and people who decided things they weren't forced into, but they had an ability to choose and go this way or that way. What they ask us to think about is what choices are there in front of us and what choices do we get to make? I'll tell you one other thing. You know the one mass documented rescue of Jews who had already been arrested by Nazis and were bound for deportation and were rescued, were freed, and stayed free until the end of the war? It's a famous incident that happened in 1943, in which the Nazis rounded up Jews who were married to Aryans, who were married to non-Jews. They rounded up the Jewish spouses and the Jewish kids, and they were holding them for deportation. And the non-Jewish spouses basically came rioted outside. They said, we want our husbands back. And the Nazis just decided it wasn't worth it. These few hundred Jews, whatever it was, just wasn't worth the headache. So they handed them back. They had already arrested them, held them for deportation. They handed them back. And those Jews survived the war. What does that say to us? It says to us that any measure of resistance with the machinery of death. I'm not talking about risking your life. Any measure of resistance might have been effective, we just don't know, because people generally didn't try it. They might not have tried it because they actively supported the massacre of Jews. That certainly happened in some places. People celebrated the deportation, the massacre of Jews, celebrated the chance to expropriate their property. That is absolutely something that happened. But there were probably plenty of places where people just didn't protest because they said, what difference will it make? Or what could I do? Or I don't really know, or how. And it turns out that a relatively small number of people making a relatively small amount of trouble was just more trouble than the whole thing was worth. I want to say one more thing about lessons we could potentially learn. All of us are familiar with Martin Niemöller's famous statement that's sort of been repurposed as a poem about how they came for every disadvantaged and despised group, and I said nothing because I wasn't a member of the group. When they came for me, it was too late. There was nobody left to speak for me. I think Niemöller meant that as a radical statement of solidarity. We all have to have each other's back. We all have to protect each other as a principle. But it is also practically a very important statement. Even if you are not moved by the principle of the need for all of us to stand in solidarity, it is practically a very important statement. The idea that I will make my peace with the forces of oppression, I will find my way, and I will be okay, not how that works. If I can go from the lofty to the somewhat less lofty, the comedian Chris Rock, whom I do not usually cite because comedian Chris Rock monologues are usually not, I wouldn't play them in front of my class. But he has a funny monologue when she talks about listening to somebody start to spew one particular kind of hate. And they're launching into anti-immigrant hate. And they're talking about illegals. And they're talking about Hispanics. And he's like, oh yeah. And he's going along and he's going along. And then all of a sudden they get to Black people and then to Jews. And he ends by saying, that train is never late. I don't know if we thought that so much. And I will say it as an I statement, maybe it's not true about you. I am American, not just by birth and upbringing. I am American like deep in my kishkas. I feel a deep identification with the United States of America, with my citizenship as an American. My grandfather, who immigrated from Poland in 1928, now if you remember what I said, it was not easy to get into the United States from Poland in 1928. He was admitted into the United States because his father had come here earlier. So that was a very common thing. The men would come to make a living and eventually send a ticket for their wives and kids. And then his wife, my great-grandmother, died, leaving two young sons in Poland without a parent. And so they were allowed to come to the United States under like a family reunification policy. It's a horrible thing to say, but my great-grandmother's death and leaving my grandfather to suffer through a childhood without his mother is also what saved his life. So it made it possible for him to leave Poland in 1928 and come to the United States, which turns out to have been a good time for a Jew to get out of Poland. My grandfather served in the United States Army as a GI in World War II and was sent back to Europe. And I still cannot get my head around what that must have meant to him, right? As an American, sent back. He was deeply identified with being an American, with his deep sense of gratitude to this country for all it had done to him. But in my deep Americanness, I have to tell you the real truth. I don't really think I experienced myself so much as a minority. I just felt very, very comfortable here, very secure here. I don't really think I experienced myself as somebody who's potentially subject to discrimination. And I don't really think I felt that way about myself, about my living here. The past year plus certainly has reminded us that as well off as we might be, as secure as we might be, as comfortable as we might be in certain ways in the United States, we are also that. We are also a minority population, potentially subject to all the kinds of things that minority populations might be subject to. And I think that it is in that framing that it is worth our thinking about what it looks like not only to think about and care about and protect our own interests, which is a really important thing, and we should do that and advocate for that, and I'm all in favor of that, but also what it looks like to take a more expansive view in which we say the way that we protect ourselves, our needs, and our interests is to make sure that every minority community and every minority religious community is secure here and does not live in fear and is not afraid that if they walk down the street in their distinctive garb, they will in some way be harmed or harassed or made to feel uncomfortable. And that the answer to that is not only going to be to look out for and secure our own well-being, but it is going to be to secure a polity in which everybody who, like we are, is a member of a religious minority or a member of a visible minority, feels like they are secure. So I began by talking about the need for us to have an accurate and clear-eyed understanding of what the Holocaust was and of what Kristallnacht was. Not simply to use it as an emotional evoker of reaction or as a point of comparison for contemporary trauma, as real as that trauma is, but to understand fully what it means and what it says about that particular event in time, what happened, and what made it so distinctively awful in the annals of all of human history. And then, if we understand that accurately, we can first begin to appreciate the ways in which our current circumstances, as painful as they are, as traumatic as they have been, as deeply unsettling to our sense of security here and in Israel as they have been, how those events are not, in fact, the same. And even then, even as we realize that those events are not, in fact, the same, we can bring that same historical gaze, that same historical lens, that same depth and precision of historical understanding to look at the events of the Holocaust and to see what they have to teach us about the lives we are living now and the situation that we are in today. And that lesson might be not to accept the reassurances and the head pats of government that everything is fine, but to know that we must stand up and advocate for our own interests when we need to do that. And those lessons might be that every single one of us has choices to make at every moment, and those choices lead to other choices, and those outcomes lead to other outcomes. And we are never simply the product of impersonal forces or gravity or pebbles rolling down a hill, but we are always able to make changes and decisions that shape the world and that shape the way that things unfold. And finally, as we have perhaps in our precarity and our vulnerability become more conscious of ourselves in this country as a minority population that is subject to some of the things that we might once have thought that our success or our achievements or our political influence shielded us from, as we recognize that in fact, all those things are important, good, and valuable, and none of those things is a guarantee. As we think about that, we might think more expansively, not only about ourselves and our own needs, but about who else and which other communities and which other people we can seek to bring along with us as we seek to make those choices that will help secure a better life for ourselves and for everyone else in this polity, even as we continue to work for a secure and better life for everyone in Israel. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions if there are questions. I Steve Bernstein is anytime I do anything that's interactive, I know I will at least have one participant knowing the person's are here.
So one of the main differences that we can see between the Holocaust and October 7th, scale of force being is the era in which they took place. We saw the perpetrators of October 7th recording their actions with their GoPro cameras. We had a telephone call that was made available of a perpetrator calling his parents and saying, look, your son killed Jews. Aren't you proud of your son? And with the Holocaust, granted, there was not that technology back then, but the example you gave of the 101st Reserve Police Force, they wrote back to their families saying how disgusting this made them. And I'm sure that was not everybody. There were people who were happy-go-lucky about killing Jews. The Nazis themselves, in many instances, tried to cover their tracks. And I think of members of the Ku Klux Klan at least have the shame to cover their faces when they're lynching blacks or lynching Jews. But with October 7th, there was a problem.
So I'm going to disagree with some of your historical analysis there.
Okay.
I think the Nazis decided to cover their tracks when it was clear that they were losing and they had the sense that they were going to be put on trial for crimes against humanity. They empty Auschwitz. The Nazis empty Auschwitz. They evacuate all the prisoners. They march them away. And they dynamite the crematorium and the gas chambers when the Soviet army is closing in January of 1945. And it's pretty clear that their crimes are going to be exposed to the world. Before that, we actually have quite a bit, although the technology was different, we have quite a bit of footage that the Nazis shot of their crimes. All of that footage that we have of, shooting at the pits that wasn't taken by the victims, that was taken by the perpetrators. We have all kinds of records. The Nazis actually saved artifacts from Jews because they planned to have like a Jewish museum, but a Jewish museum of the exterminated Jewish people. Like, this is what we got rid of, so we'll save one of everything in a museum somewhere. And so while the technology makes it land differently, it is true that I spoke about the people of Reserve Battalion 101 who are disgusted and horrified, but I said specifically those are not the SS officers who've really been ideologically inculcated in this belief system. They're the ones who are ordinary guys who get called up for reserve duty. The SS officers are the recipients of that famous speech that you're going to be the heroes of the German people, even if you can't really talk about what you did here. And we have footage, we have images. There's actually released pretty recently, discovered pretty recently, of like the Auschwitz guards on their day off. And it's just like, you can't wrap your brain around it. They're playing the accordion and picking blueberries and all kinds of things, because like however many days a week you work at Auschwitz murdering people, and then on your off day you go pick blueberries and play the accordion because and so I'm not, again, the technology is different. I'm not sure that I agree with the core claim. It is certainly true that given the scale of the Holocaust, there were many, I think I mentioned this, but it's important to be clear, there were many, many, many people involved as perpetrators, some of whom were clearly enthusiastic. Again, there were people who were happy to kick their Jewish neighbors out and steal their property and not let them come back after the war if they survived, and people who were more reluctant and felt bad about it, and people who lied to themselves and everybody else about what was going on. Yes?
There are a few points that you made that I'm struggling with a little bit. One, you said that this is not 1938, and I don't think most of us think it's 1938, but is it 1930? Is it the beginning of making common discussion of white nationalism, that this is a Christian country, the rise of white nationalism, we heard that the police in Amsterdam held back, that they didn't really protect the people there, that, just like a glimmer of something that is not 1938, but is it 1930? The kind of rhetoric, at the GA they were talking about, the anti-Semitism among the medical profession. We don't want to see Zionist doctors. We can't see Zionist patients. It's very fringe. But is it the beginning of something? And I think that is more what people are feeling. Not that it's 19. I don't think anyone believes that this government is going to sanction a gas chamber or anything like Kristallnacht. But is there something in the air? I think that's what people are sensing that's different than it was 10 years ago.
Can I ask I'm cognizant of the fact that we have so many people here. We also have a tremendous amount of people on Zoom. I'm getting a text saying, can you please just recap just the main part of the question before you answer?
Sure, I apologize for not doing that before. Recap the main part of the question. Okay, so it's not 1938, but maybe it's at 1930, and things are starting to really head in a problematic direction. And maybe it's not as far along as laws stripping Jews of their citizenship and then official government violent actions against Jews, but is something happening? So the first thing I'll just say about nobody says it's 1938, there's a certain prominent Jewish communal official who I've been listening to give a speech. I've been hearing him speech for 30 some odd years that this is the worst year for anti-Semitism since 1938. And the problem with it, I've been hearing you give that speech since the 1990s, is that when it might actually be true, it's lost some of its power because you've been saying it every year since, at least since I've been hearing it since the 1990s. But I agree that that is a different question and an important question to be asking. I will say that as an historian, the idea that things were nifty, swifty, and amazeballs for Jews in America until 20 minutes ago is just not accurate. There was a great deal of official anti-Semitism. I talked about to some extent in the context of immigration, but there are many other contexts in which it shows up. There's a great deal of official anti-Semitism through and even after World War II. Systemic anti-Semitism in all kinds of ways. Random has nothing to do with anything, but I wrote my doctorate about the Manhattan Project, development of the atomic bomb during World War II, and the way the security establishment of both the FBI and the Army related to the Jewish scientists. It was clear there's an enormous amount of suspicion that all Jews are communists and all Jews are disloyal and all Jews are radical. Very different source. We have Harry Truman's diaries. Harry Truman, president, recognized state of Israel. I think Jews thought he was like generally a pretty decent guy. We have his diaries now, and in his diary at one point he writes about the Jews in the displaced persons camps in Europe. Now remember, these are Jews who survived the Holocaust, can't go home or don't want to go home, have no place else to go because it's 1946, it's 1947, there's no state of Israel, the United States still won't take them. They are still in camps in Europe. And understandably enough, they're getting a little restive, they're getting a little unhappy. And Truman writes about them in his diaries in such horrifying ways, such ways loaded with anti-Semitic stereotypes. They're so pushy. They always want to be taken care of first. They always want to get that. What are you talking about? These are Holocaust survivors. So I don't think it's always been grand. In the 1930s, of course, you had Henry Ford publishing a newspaper that simply existed to spread his anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And having said that, I will certainly say that I agree with you that things feel different recently than they have in my lifetime. And I would like to say the following. Can we please not do the thing that our community has sometimes done? Where if you're on the political right, you say that anti-Semitism is a problem on the political left, and you point to the young progressive Congress people who are exceptionally critical of Israel. And if you are a Jew on the left, you point to the people on the right and you say, what about Unite the Right and Charlottesville and Jews will not replace us? Can we please agree that there has been a significant resurgence of vocal anti-Semitism in the United States from lots of corners, and we would do well as a Jewish community to stand against it from whichever corners it comes, not to decide that only anti-Semitism that comes from not my political team counts. That is not going to be a good approach for us. The best way to make sure it's not 1930 is for us to make different choices. For us, there were Jews who lived in Germany in 1933 and 34 and 35 who said, probably I could wait this out. Probably I could ride this out. That's not all short-sightedness. It is also, again, we have to keep saying there was no place to go. To the extent that we have political voice, agency, influence, power, we should use it. And we're seeing lots of Jewish people in lots of different places try to do that in whatever ways they can. To the extent we don't have it, we should probably marshal that. To the extent we can build solidarity with other people, we should do that too, instead of not building solidarity and then wondering why other people don't stand in solidarity with us and we haven't said, right, all kinds of things. But I think that's a very good question. Historians are not so great about predicting the future. We do better with the past. And I think that that gets back to the choices that we have and the things that we can do and things that we can try to do differently, having the example of the past to learn from. Yes?
You mentioned, I mean, October 7th, horrifying, terrible. You mentioned certain distinctions between that though and the Holocaust and the existence of the state of Israel and the power of the United States and questions of scale. One issue you didn't mention, or I didn't hear you mention, was do you think it's a significant difference also that October 7th took place in the context of Palestinians, Israelis, Gaza, a political history between those groups? Do you think that's a relevant difference also?
I don't think that's the
Can you
most,
recap the question?
sorry, I apologize. The question was, aside from the differences that I mentioned between the Holocaust and October 7th, what about the differences of that there's a political history here between Israelis and Palestinians, and that also might have some bearing on this being different. I don't think that that's the most salient difference here in terms of the analogy of Jewish precarity and vulnerability. I actually think that doesn't make Jews feel less precarious or vulnerable. Indeed, the sense of the people whom we feel threatened by live with us or among us or across a close border from us might actually contribute to the sense of, so that is about a subjective Jewish experience of precarity and fear. And in that sense, I think that our saying that October 7th is just like the Holocaust is allowing the proximity of the fear of October 7th to cloud our understanding of what the Holocaust actually was. But I don't think that the geopolitical conversation which, lessens people's feeling of precarity or fear in the wake of October 7th. And one of the experiences that I've had quite a few times in the past year is of having that conversation with Israelis where you try to say, well, what is I can't talk to you about the political conversation on the landscape or anything else. Right now, I don't feel safe in my home. That doesn't mean that there isn't a conversation to be had, but in terms of that experience of it, I think that's the experience of it. Yes.
Last question.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to hear your talk. And when we look at history, we know that there's things, have we gone to the left, have we gone to the right? When we think about Kristallnacht, and when I think about it this year, that could have been really the main thing because look what happened afterwards. But I want to ask you, as a historical point, I don't know, like World War I, did it start because of the assassination of the Archbishop? But you said at the outset, would Kristallnacht have happened anyway had that assassination not taken place? But that's a real key thing. I think it's overlooked. Look at the whole picture.
So the question was about the assassination by Herschel Grunspan, the 17-year-old Polish-Jewish young man in Paris of a German diplomat, and whether that was the precipitating factor of Kristallnacht. I think that again, Kristallnacht was not a spontaneous uprising in response to that killing. And I think that it was a convenient hook to hang it on, but that would suggest that if you're looking to unleash mass violence and you were looking for a hook to hang it on, you didn't find the hook you were looking for, you might have found some other hook. I think to say this was actually caused by that assassination is to attribute far more importance to that particular action, which I don't actually think too many people necessarily paid all that much attention to, except that it was, again, a convenient thing to drive the narrative around and use to create a sense of, oh, this is the thing that inspired the rage of the German people. I don't particularly think that historians think that was actually the thing that inspired the rage of the German people, mostly because historians don't really think Kristallnacht was about the rage of the German people as much as it was, again, an organized, government-abetted, intentionally launched set of violent actions, and in a certain way, a proof of concept. We've been doing all these things to legally deprive Jews of rights and to legally deprive Jews of property and to legally deprive Jews of professions and universities, and nobody's been stopping us all that much. Well, let's see what happens when we go to the next step and we unleash violence, and yet again, nobody's stopping us all that much. So that establishes that we can probably keep going. And again, that gets back to the functionalists saying, right, not Hitler intended an eliminationist program from the beginning, but it was like, let's try it and let's see, and let's next step, and then what happens and who makes what decision, and had other actors made other decisions and responded differently, then the course of events might have been changed. I think Reverend Brander wants us to put a stop to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. I just want to thank Dr. Schwartz again for coming out. You used to have a very active Twitter. It's a little less active now, the
Oh,
last couple of years.
it's non-existent now.
But her thoughts are available and written in different blogs and op-eds in different places. I encourage people to look for them. I definitely do. And you often hear them sometimes from this pulpit as I quote them. But it's really an honor to have you in our shul. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Loews again for sponsoring this very important gathering. I wish everyone a good night. And as I always do, please drive carefully as you leave. There's one way in, one way out. So please get home safely. Have a good night.
Real